Picture this. It's 2007, and an entire nation finds itself under a full-blown digital siege. This wasn't just some isolated hack. It was a defining moment in the history of cyber warfare. So today, we're going to break down the 2007 attacks on Estonia, a conflict that literally changed how countries think about national security forever.
I mean, really think about that question. What happens when the target isn't just a company or a single website, but the entire digital backbone of a country? Well, in Estonia, which was one of the most internet-savvy nations on Earth, they found out the hard way. The answer? Paralyzed banks, media outlets silenced, and a government that's struggling just to talk to its own people.
So how did it even get to that point? You know, this whole digital war, it didn't actually start with code or on a server. It started out there, in the real world. It kicked off with a deeply political and emotional dispute that just spiraled into something the world had never, ever seen before. So right at the heart of this whole thing was this statue, the Bronze Soldier of Tallinn. Now, for some, this was a sacred memorial to those who fought against Nazism, but for many others, it was a painful symbol of Soviet occupation. So when the Estonian government decided to move it from its central spot in April 2007, things just exploded, first with furious protests on the streets, and then almost immediately online.
And this timeline, wow, it really shows you just how fast everything went off the rails. The government announces the plan in January. They start moving the statue on April 26th. And the very next day, bam, the first wave of cyber attacks hits. But this wasn't just a quick hit. It was a sustained 22-day campaign that peaked around May 9th. And that date's significant. It's known as Victory Day in Russia. So how in the world do you get enough digital firepower to attack an entire country? Well, the crazy part is, the mobilization wasn't happening on some secret dark web channel. Nope, it was all happening right out in the open, turning everyday internet users into this massive volunteer digital army.
And listen, this is a really crucial point. The people organizing the attacks just posted everything you'd need to join in on public Russian-language forums. They weren't hiding, they were actively recruiting. And that just radically lowered the barrier to entry. You didn't need to be some elite hacker anymore. You just had to be angry and able to follow a few simple instructions. It was basically crowdsourced cyber warfare.
Think about it. These forum posts were basically a complete cyber attack 101 kit. They told people why they should be furious. They gave them a list of who to target. Government sites, media outlets, banks. They told them when to strike to have the biggest impact. And most importantly, they explained how to do it with step-by-step guides and simple tools for beginners. All right, so let's pop the hood and get into the real technical guts of this siege. How exactly did they bring a country's digital life to a grinding halt? Well, it all came down to one primary weapon, and it was brutally effective.
And that weapon was the Distributed Denial of Service Attack, or DDoS. The concept is actually pretty simple. You just flood a target, like a website, with so much junk traffic from so many different computers that real, legitimate users just can't get through. It's like creating a massive instant traffic jam on the information superhighway that blocks every single on-ramp. So this whole operation really breaks down into 4 key stages. First, you have that public mobilization we just talked about. Second, the assembly of the firepower, which meant renting these huge networks of infected computers, we call them botnets, from all over the world. Third, the attack itself, aiming that fire hose of traffic. And finally, and this is key, adaptation. This wasn't a fire-and-forget mission. The attackers were actively watching Estonia's defenses and changing their tactics on the fly. And they weren't just a one-trick pony either. They had a whole arsenal of techniques. Things like ping floods, which is kind of like relentlessly ringing a doorbell 1,000,000 times a second just to tie up the line. But they also used more complex methods, like sending floods of junk data packets or messed-up web requests that are designed to confuse servers and make them waste all their resources trying to figure it out. And you can see right here, this is where the attack really evolved. That first wave, it was noisy, it was chaotic, a lot of what we'd call script kiddies hitting those high-profile government and media sites. But that second wave, it was different. It was highly coordinated, it was way more technically advanced, and frankly, it had a much more sinister set of targets. That's right. The second wave went straight for the jugular. By targeting banks and DNS, which is basically the internet's phone book, the attackers were trying to cause absolute maximum disruption to the daily lives of Estonian citizens. All of a sudden, you can't get to your money, you can't pay your bills, and huge parts of the Estonian internet just vanish.
This was way past digital graffiti. This was economic warfare.
So you're Estonia. You're under siege from this global, anonymous swarm. What do you even do? How do you defend against an attack of this magnitude? Well, Estonia's defenders, they had to pretty much invent the playbook in real time, right in the middle of a national crisis. Their main response was, honestly, radical. To stop the bleeding, they did the digital equivalent of pulling up the castle drawbridge. They effectively took Estonia offline from the rest of the world, blocking almost all foreign internet traffic. Then, they painstakingly started to open up connections one by one to trusted countries. And that was only possible because of this incredible coordination between the government, their cyber emergency response team, and international partners who jumped in to help. So in the middle of all this chaos, the million-dollar question was, who is actually doing this? The problem was, the attacks were coming from those botnets, infected computers in dozens of countries all over the globe. So while the motivation was clearly tied to the political fight with Russia, proving that the state itself was directly involved was, and still is, incredibly difficult. This fog of war is a huge feature of modern cyber conflicts. But here's the thing. As awful as this was for Estonia, it ended up being this massive global wake-up call. The lessons that were learned in those 22 days of crisis in 2007, they became the foundation for the modern cyber defense playbook that nations everywhere use today. And this quote right here, it just nails the biggest lesson of all. Technology alone isn't going to save you. Real cyber resilience comes from having a plan, from coordinating across the entire nation. And that idea led directly to the creation of places like the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which, fittingly, was set up in Tallinn, Estonia, just a year later. So the playbook today looks totally different. Nations now pay for massive services to filter out or scrub attack traffic before it even gets close. They build redundancy into critical systems like DNS, so there's no single point of failure. They have clear plans for how to talk to the public when things go wrong. And maybe most important of all, they practice. They run huge drills to make sure they're ready for the real thing. So in the end, you could say that Estonia became this unwilling, living laboratory for nation-state cyber conflict. They went through a brutal, sustained attack, but the lessons they learned and then shared with the world ultimately made everyone safer. Their pain accelerated the development of the defenses and the international cooperation that we now consider standard practice. And that brings us to a pretty sobering final thought. The tools and the tactics that were pioneered back in 2007 have only gotten more powerful, more sophisticated, and way more accessible. Back then, the world watched as one small, digitally advanced nation got targeted. Today, with how much we all depend on our digital infrastructure, well, the reality is everyone is a potential target.